It is the morning of November 9th, 1898. A dark morning to be alive in Raleigh, North Carolina. The city, despite the 2 a.m. hour, had not calmed after an unruly night. The governor, Daniel Russell, had only just returned from a train trip. Russell had gone to vote in his hometown of Wilmington the previous day, Election Day. It wasn't supposed to have been a risky trip. Russell had made arrangements with opposition forces. It was supposed to calm the waters. It had not. The trip out had been fine. The Republican Russell was escorted around by a couple of relatives who were part of the local Democratic Party. Once he had voted, Russell got back on the train to return to Raleigh. That's when things started to go wrong. The city of Wilmington was already an armed camp ready to explode, but Russell hadn't had any problems. The train is where all his problems finally started to catch up to him. The train stopped at Maxton, close to the South Carolina border, and friendly travelers were not the people who got on board. Armed men dressed in red boarded the train to look for Russell. They were members of a white supremacy group called the Red Shirts. Like the KKK that had been disbanded 20 years earlier, but there was one key difference. They didn't wear masks. They didn't need to. They had no fear of retribution from the authorities. They had come to find Russell. Blessedly for him, the higher-ups who had been encouraging and funding the Red Shirts did not actually want Russell dead. So he was hidden in a mail car on his way back to Raleigh by a higher-up Red Shirt and future governor of North Carolina, who made sure he stayed safe. Russell was not lynched that day. When he rolled into Raleigh at 2 a.m. the next day, things had not calmed down. Red Shirts paraded through the streets and gathered outside his mansion shouting, "Lynch the fat son of a bitch." When Russell picked up a copy of the Raleigh News and Observer, edited and owned by Democratic partisan Josephus Daniels, it contained not only the results of the election, which spelled an end to Republican relevance in North Carolina, but a quote from his inauguration speech: "There is retribution in history." Russell's career in politics was over 2 years before the end of his term as governor. He would be surrounded by enemies for the rest of his time in office. But there was also one more problem in the periphery of his mind. One more thought plagued him. Boy, I sure owe a lot of money. In 1898, the Democratic Party ran the White Supremacy campaign and retook North Carolina from Republicans and populists. Also, Daniel Russell was in debt. A lot of debt. So, he needed money. And looking around the governor's office on that dark morning, there was the kindling for a plan. A very strange plan, but one that would burn bright nonetheless. To explain Russell's solution to his debt problem, we need to go back in time. We need to understand how Daniel Russell got into power, what he had done while he had had power, and who the enemies dancing outside his door were. You have to know where you came from to know where you are going. That's how stories work. And railroads. There is retribution in railroads, after all. Eastern North Carolina, just outside of Wilmington in 1845. Just in time to be a child soldier in the Confederate Army. As a captain. Don't worry about him, though. He didn't see much action unless you count trying to kill your superior officer as action, in which case, he did. The dispute was nominally about comments about Russell's father, but there were other issues at play. Forced conscription, enthusiasm about a war effort that in 1864 was less intense than one would think, and that Russell's father hadn't really supported the war effort to start with, among them. The solution to getting Russell out of trouble for his attempted fracking was far more simple, however. Bald-faced corruption. His father used his money and connections to first get Russell appointed to the county commission by the governor, and then elected to the state legislature. The plan was for the immunity granted by these offices to make him immune to these charges. The whole thing finally ended up in front of Confederate President Jefferson Davis via the Attorney General of the Confederacy, who was also from Wilmington. Russell was allowed to walk without any consequences. Also, the Civil War ended and no one cared. Anyway, this illustrates the level of wealth Russell was born into. These offices were just playthings to his father, practically handed to the younger Russell as if they had no importance. Now, you could, of course, say that political offices in the 1864 Confederacy did have no importance, but let's put that to one side. In 1862, when the outlook was slightly sunnier for the Confederacy, the older Russell had gotten elected to the same legislative seat, while telling everyone he wasn't running. On the other hand, Russell wasn't even old enough to be in the state legislature when he quote-unquote got elected. So yeah, consequences, what are those? The governor of North Carolina and the president of the Confederacy have his back. He is incredibly wealthy. Unfortunately for Russell, he lived in a time and place that is terrible for staying wealthy, the post-Civil War South. We will get to that mess in a minute, because it's now time to talk about Daniel Russell, the politician, instead of Daniel Russell, the plantation owner. He is, despite being a member of the elite, not a Democrat. Repeat, this southern plantation owner is not a Democrat. If you wish to know the problem with that distinction, well, here's the map of the election of 1860 that elected Lincoln. See those red states? Those are Republican states, and none of those are in the South. That's why it's a problem. Now, Russell does get elected a local judge because he's a lawyer, and he also serves in Congress, although not as a Republican, strangely enough. I'll get back to that in a second. Russell had tried his hand at politics, but by the 1880s, his political future seemed done. Democrats had essentially ended Republican involvement in political office at the state level with the end of Reconstruction. Russell was nominated to the Supreme Court by the Republican ticket in 1888, but he turned it down. He gave many reasons for it, but one that stands out is that the pay was too little, which is not a good sign for our formerly incredibly wealthy plantation heir. So how did that happen? Russell at this point was running the plantation, having inherited it from his dad. He was also working as a lawyer, and for a very brief time, president of the Wilmington, Onslow, and East Carolina Railroad. You might wonder why a person of Russell's immense wealth would need to do these things, and well, that kind of ties into the other half of the story here. Because while Russell did own an immense plantation, it was massive, it wasn't exactly profitable. Farming was not exactly the path to wealth it had once been. Things had not gone well for farmers since the war, and that's a problem. For Russell, but also more interestingly, for the Democratic Party that had seized power post-Reconstruction. Things were going badly for the Democratic Party in 1892. If I had to pick a culprit to blame for all their political misfortunes, I'd say it's white farmers. Maybe that's a bit unfair, but the new factor in the political calculus was a more politically active base of white farmers, so it's hard to point at anything else. They'd all joined a non-political organization called the Farmers Alliance. It was very non-political and definitely didn't do political things like organize farmers to vote in blocks and primaries for fellow members and organize around issues. Oh wait, it did do those things. So, what kind of issues did the Farmers Alliance organize around? The issues farmers cared about the most, mostly the fact that their way of life was under attack from external pressures, those pressures being mostly economic. The products that they grew no longer sold for as high a price as they used to, railroads treated them unfairly, and the state legislators seemed to be in the pocket of Big Railroad. And I'm not just saying that because the railroad set up a brothel down the street from the state capitol during one particular legislative session. I'm saying it because railroads had a habit of buying the favor of legislators by giving them free passes on the railroad, which seems cheap to me, but what do I know about the going rate of politicians in the Old South? Anyway, in 1892, the white farmers of North Carolina and the Democratic Party came to a crossroads and split. The white farmers wanted policies more geared to benefit them, and the people in charge of the Democratic Party did not. So they split. The farmers joined the newly formed Populist Party to compete with the Democrats and the Republicans already present in North Carolina. They lost. Not enough white farmers left the Democratic Party to buoy the Populists, and they finished telescopic third place. This was not totally unexpected. The Populist candidate for governor was a legit psycho who attempted to stab a future Democratic gubernatorial candidate to death during the campaign, an alliance member who had stayed loyal to the Democrats. The Republican in the race also got votes. The eagle-eyed among you might have noticed something interesting about the amount of votes received. If you add up the votes between the Populist candidate for the governor and the Republican candidate, it's more than the Democratic candidate, which will be very important shortly for someone we have neglected, but a little more about the Populists, and then back to Russell. Okay, so from the Democratic perspective, the white farmers/Populists have stabbed them in the back, a betrayal that cannot be forgiven. So having won the 1892 state election in North Carolina, how did they pay these patocks back? Oh, well, they basically killed the Farmers Alliance. They did a bunch of things to its state-granted charter in the 1893 legislative session, and essentially made it impossible for the alliance to be a pain in the Democratic's butt ever again. The Populist Party still existed, but the Farmers Alliance was on life support. R.I.P., little buddy. The General Assembly of North Carolina adjourned that year on March 6th. The Democrats were very confident they had nothing to worry about. The poor white farmers of North Carolina had been put in their place. Power of the Democratic Party had been upheld. 2 months later, the stock market dropped 25% in one day. Okay, bad, but this is North Carolina. They do things differently down here. Who cares about the stock market? Cotton is king, if you didn't know. In 1892, the price of a pound of cotton in New York was 9 cents. In November 1893, it was 8 cents. In November 1894, the next legislative election, it was 5 cents. So where it once was around 9 cents a pound, it is now 5 cents. 5-cent cotton. Not a good slogan to hear when you are the political party in charge and you're going to be depending on white farmers to maintain that power. So the Democrats are in real trouble, but who's taking advantage of it? Republicans or populists? ¿Por qué no los dos? Why not both? In 1894, the Republicans and populists agreed not to get in each other's way. Where Republicans had the advantage, populists would vote for them. Where populists had the advantage, Republicans would vote for them. The agreement was called fusion, and against all odds, it worked. Goodbye Democratic monopoly in the State House, hello populists and Republicans running things. They not only took the State House, but because of a wonderful quirk of events, they got to appoint 2 senators in one legislative term. 1 populist and 1 Republican. The Democratic Party was in a proverbial ditch. Fast forwarding to 1896, although the price of cotton had recovered somewhat, the popularity of the Democratic Party had not. Fusion was agreed upon again in 1896 with the added bonus of the governor's office being up for grabs. The populists ceded the governor's office to the Republicans, so it was up to them to choose who got the job. And finally, it is time for us to reintroduce to the stage Daniel Russell. Russell, 15 years after last holding office and 8 years after saying he didn't want to run again because the pay wasn't good enough, wants to be governor. The pay is apparently now good enough for him at $3,000 a year. And he's not the only Republican who wants to be governor. It's the first time there's a pretty good chance of it happening in 20 years. Russell was in a really good position because he's got a very strong endorsement, Jeter C. Pritchard. Pritchard is the man Republicans had chosen to be the senator after winning in 1894. Which is really underselling his endorsement because with Pritchard's endorsement came half of the 2 pillars of the state Republican Party. One half of the state Republican Party was the Mountain Republicans, people who'd never wanted to join the Confederacy because frankly they didn't own slaves and it's not relevant to them. Not to say that they overly cared about the fate of African Americans, they do not. That's the constituency that Senator Pritchard represented and swung towards Daniel Russell. That only leaves the other half of the Republican Party, and oh dear, it's African Americans. You know, the African Americans who joined the Republican Party because it's the party of Lincoln who freed them from slavers, people who own slaves, to work the plantations that they owned, like the one owned by Daniel Russell. So yeah, that's a bit of a hill, but it's not an insurmountable one. Yes, Daniel Russell is from a modern perspective terrible on race, not just restricted to the plantation thing. When Russell was a local judge, he more or less ruled on his own initiative that separate but equal should be the law of the land. In that 1888 letter where he said he couldn't run for the Supreme Court because it didn't pay enough, he also said that black people in the South were savages, which is not something he shied away from saying. In testimony before Congress, he said that black people weren't generally competent to serve on juries and speculated at length about the ethnic background of some bandits that lived near him, which should not add up to him shaving off enough support from the black section of the Republican Party to get the nomination. But somehow he wiggles through. How? Well, for one thing, context. And yes, a lot of these things are bad regardless of context, but not all of them. When Russell was testifying in front of Congress, he was testifying in front of a committee having hearings about the Ku Klux Acts, in favor of those acts to crack down on the Ku Klux Klan. This was happening while the governor of North Carolina was being impeached by Democrats for cracking down on the very same Ku Klux Klan, which was impressive, but was not what the African American community was looking for in a candidate. He was 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back. They wanted a bigger say in government, more political offices, state and local offices that had been closed off to them by Democratic dominance at the state level, and they wanted it more opened up. Russell was not the best candidate when it came to that for them. So what African American support Russell did manage to rustle up, was more ideological than anything. What does that mean? Russell was a greenbacker as a congressman. That is essentially what the populists are now. When the Greenbacker Party disintegrated, Russell returned to being a Republican. He didn't bolt for the Populists this time around, but he was very ideologically aligned with them. The similarity of the Greenbackers and the Populists cannot be overstated, and I will give you the most direct line between the two parties. The 1880 Greenbacker candidate for president was James B. Weaver. The 1892 Populist candidate for president was James B. Weaver. It's the same issues and the same people. The exact same policy prescriptions are different, but you know who they are and why they are there. It makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Russell is still the large plantation owner, so any problems that are hitting small farmers are hitting him just writ large. Their concerns are his concerns. So Russell has an inside track to win support from the Populists. This ideology was not just appealing to white people. Russell's African-American support, limited though it was, came from African-Americans who favored a similar ideology to reduce the debt paying to farmers because a lot of African-Americans were also farmers. It makes sense some of them would support Russell. Ultimately, Russell won the Republican nomination for governor by a hair and won the governor's election by 2 hairs. And that is how Russell became governor. Now let's talk about Russell's fall. You know how this ends from the beginning of the video. The train ride from hell. It wasn't the worst train ride someone took that week, but we will get there. In this tragedy, Russell can be considered the author of his own downfall. You see, Russell picked a fight with a very strong opponent. A very, very strong opponent. Southern Railway. Southern Railway was a conglomeration of various Southern railroads that had gone belly up during the Panic of 1893 that had given us 5-cent cotton. Who would be powerful enough to scoop up all these derelict railroads during a panic? J.P. Morgan. Yes, the bank guy. One of the richest people on earth. That's the guy Russell is starting a fight with. Southern Railway, born in 1894, was a major player in Southern politics. The previous governor of North Carolina had signed an agreement with Southern Railway for a 99-year lease on the state-owned North Carolina Railroad. Which, if you think that sounds corrupt as hell, you are on the same page as most other North Carolinians. Headlines read, "Is it a blunder or is it a crime?" "A monstrous transaction," and "Desperate defiance of the people's will." That was just one page of one newspaper. So it's not a terrible idea to go after this lease. It's an idea that has a deep well of support. A lot of Democrats and populists really truly do support it. So Russell really dug in on the subject. He got to understand literally everything about the North Carolina Railroad and the lease. He then assembled a team of lawyers to write a law that would revoke the lease. The law did this through a variety of means, requiring corporations from outside the state operating a railroad in the state to get a license, making the license revocable at the governor's discretion, and just straight up revoking the lease. Russell also put on a full court pressure outside of the bill. He prompted hearings on whether there could have been another lessor for the railroad, as he had found another bidder. He attacked the Railroad Commission for being in the pocket of the railroads. And nothing worked. The bill failed. The hearings resulted in little more than headlines. Southern Railway got a restraining order against Russell in a federal court regarding the Railroad Commission. Failure, failure, failure. Russell couldn't catch a break. Well, not entirely true. He did find support from an unlikely source. The News and Observer, run by Democratic partisan and populist sympathetic Josephus Daniels, ran a mysterious interview with a man named Mr. X who supported Russell's attack on the lease, and was very knowledgeable about the subject. Some would say too knowledgeable. Now we have no idea who this mysterious Mr. X was. It could have been anybody. Teddy Roosevelt, the recently deceased Zebulon Vance, or even Oscar Wilde. Anybody. Daniel Russell had an exact copy of the interview in memo form in his papers. Anyway, Mr. X could have been anybody. What Russell's fight did do was shatter his support among Republicans. The Republicans were a business-friendly party at the time, and a majority did not support him in this fight. Democrats and populists did support his attack, but they didn't really support him overall because he was a Republican. This left Russell dangerously isolated come 1898. And here we come to where we opened the video. Russell alone in his mansion, surrounded by white supremacists after the 1898 election. To give the full story, this would be the third time Republicans and populists would attempt fusion. It would also be the last. The Democrats organized under the banner of white supremacy to retake the legislature. Not just retake, but reconquer. Permanently. The coffers of the Democratic Party were full thanks to a special appeal made by Furnifold Simmons to railroad companies to fund them. Furnifold Simmons, the leader of this white supremacy campaign, later recounted this fundraising tactic in his autobiography. During the campaign, I secured the services of former Governor T.J. Jarvis to visit the bankers, the railroad officials, and the manufacturers of the state, to represent to them the intolerable conditions prevailing under the fusion domination, to persuade them that it was their duty to assist in effecting a change of regime, and to solicit funds for the campaign. Jarvis was engaged in this task for weeks, and most successful in his appeal. From those economic leaders and from various Democrats of moderate means, I obtained all the campaign funds I needed. So it turns out, attacking the railroad companies, while broadly popular, has consequences, especially when one of them is owned by one of the richest men on earth. Now, I don't know that J.P. Morgan funded the white supremacy campaign. I haven't been able to find out who funded this criminal conspiracy. Notes for specific amounts and people have been hard to come by for some reason. Except again, Furnifold Simmons including it in his autobiography. In the same book, Simmons also said he promised not to increase taxes on corporations during the next legislative session. But it's not enough to have money, you also need foot soldiers. Democrats also had plenty of those as well. Along the southern border with South Carolina, a white supremacist paramilitary organization called the Redshirts that had already been used to subdue the state of South Carolina moved in and suppressed the African American vote through violence. To describe the effect of these South Carolinians on the outcome of 1898, let us return to one Josephus Daniels of the News and Observer writing about the events in 1941, who said, quote, "The South Carolinians, having participated in the Red Shirt parades, though they had as much to do with the election as the North Carolinians, in fact, not a few of them naturalized themselves for a few days in order to vote, which swelled the majorities in the counties bordering on their state." Josephus Daniels was one of the leaders of the white supremacy campaign in North Carolina, so if anyone would know, it would have been him. He threw a massive party for the Redshirts after the election. The Redshirts so thoroughly controlled the election mechanisms in the south of the state that not only couldn't African Americans vote, but South Carolinians, at least according to Josephus Daniels, could. So what does Daniel Russell do in the face of all this? He's the governor of North Carolina. A well-funded reign of terror has descended upon his state. How does he deal with this? Pretty badly, it turns out. He's admittedly not unique in this, but he was the one person who might have been able to do something about it. His attacks on the Southern Railroad had alienated pro-business Republicans, so no support there. They've in fact enriched his enemies. The populists have been attempting to switch from fusing with Republicans to fusing with Democrats, mainly because Bryan's pro-silver stand in the 1896 presidential election had proved to be popular among the rank and file. This leaves Russell's base of support as non-existent. By the time fusion was agreed to between the populists and the Republicans, it was September. The Democrats were already heavily organized. Russell's hometown of Wilmington, near the border of South Carolina, was an armed camp, with a population armed to the teeth against their black neighbors. Alfred M. Waddell, the man Russell had beaten to win his congressional seat, spoke for the white supremacists in Wilmington when he said that they would choke the Cape Fear River with black bodies if they had to. On October 26th, Russell issued a proclamation to try and preserve the peace, which had zero effect, except to give Democrats a target for their anger. An October 29th rally in Wilmington for fusion was canceled. Eventually, in Wilmington itself, Russell tried to keep the peace by negotiating away actually running Republican candidates. In the 1898 election, no Republican votes were recorded in Wilmington because the candidates withdrew at the behest of the governor. To give you an idea of the level of fault Russell had in not resisting the white supremacy campaign, let's contrast what Russell did with what other people did. Senator Pritchard, the man whose endorsement essentially got Russell the governorship, and no friend to African Americans, got in contact with the White House and urged intervention. North Carolina Representative George H. White, the last black congressperson from the South until Barbara Jordan in 1973, asked President McKinley to intervene. But the McKinley administration wouldn't intervene unless Russell asked, and he never did. On the day of the election, Russell went to Wilmington to vote in person. His train was surrounded by a red shirt mob twice at train stations on his return to the state capitol, and he barely escaped with his life. He got off light compared to what happened to the black citizens of Wilmington that he was supposed to be protecting. 2 days after the election, the white supremacists of Wilmington arose with violence and expelled the Republican city government of Wilmington at gunpoint. Many African Americans died, many also fled. Some were exiled from town at gunpoint by train, a fate far worse than Russell had experienced. Russell, upon receiving the early news reports of what was happening in Wilmington, ordered the National Guard to be placed under the command of one Lieutenant Commander Walker Taylor. Walker Taylor was one of the men who had protected him in Wilmington when he voted, and also, unbeknownst to Russell, one of the white supremacist leaders in Wilmington. The white supremacist campaign ended with a lot of people dead and Russell terminally discredited. He was a lame duck who now had to deal with an overwhelming Democratic legislature with almost no support, populist or Republican. Daniel L. Russell's time as a functional governor was over 2 years before the term would end. There is retribution in history, the header of the News and Observer declared that day after the election. And Russell is still broke. Can't forget about that. So Russell needs a way to make money. How could he use the levers of government to make that money? What could he find that would allow him to be solvent? Well, I've already told you. It's been there the whole time, a major part of the narrative. The North Carolina Railroad. What, you thought the Southern Railroad was the only one who was going to use this North Carolina Railroad to make money? Hell no. You know all that research into the North Carolina Railroad and the Southern Railway lease? Turns out it was actually good for something, which makes this Chekhov's steam whistle. Daniel Russell had found some outstanding debt that had been repudiated by North Carolina. It was part of a much larger body of repudiated debt from the post-Reconstruction era. Democrats had, upon retaking power in southern states, repudiated a lot of debt that had been issued for Reconstruction. Because Reconstruction wasn't cheap. How much debt had Southern Democrats repudiated? About $300 million worth. In $1865, not $2025. So it's a lot. How were Southern Democrats able to accomplish this miracle of financial engineering? The 11th Amendment. For non-lawyers out there, the 11th Amendment was a hotfix to the Constitution after the Bill of Rights passed. You see, one of the first cases the Supreme Court took up was Chisholm v. Georgia over some outstanding debts Georgia owed. In Chisholm v. Georgia, the Supreme Court took the surprising stance that Georgia did in fact owe the money. This caused a brief panic, and the 11th Amendment was the result. States couldn't be sued for debts by individuals. There's more to it than that, but that's good enough for our purposes. This is how southern states were able to put the kibosh on $300 million worth of debt. Now, they didn't outright cancel it. In most cases, they just paid a much lower amount than the original debt, paying part of the debt instead of canceling it outright. This seemingly odd turn makes more sense when you realize the people who own the debt are probably people southern state governments are going to want to borrow from in the future. So, since they didn't want the future interest rates to be 11 billion%, they chipped them off a little to avoid that. To give a very relevant example, the bonds Russell thinks he can make some money off of. These bonds were repudiated but could be redeemed at 25% face value, no interest. The bonds themselves were face value $1,000 with interest of $1,740 more for a total of $2,740 per bond versus what was being paid, $250. As you can guess, not everyone was on board with this plan of getting roughly 10 times less for the bond than it was worth, so they held on to their bonds in the hopes they could secure a better settlement. Daniel Russell thinks he has a way to get these bonds paid for a lot more than what North Carolina is offering, which is a bit of an ethical quandary. He's currently the governor of the state that will have to pay if he succeeds. He is working to move money from North Carolina's bank account to his. Which, there's a constitutional amendment against that. In 1879, resurgent North Carolina Democrats had passed a constitutional amendment against paying those bonds. So he is very much in a legal and ethical gray area as the chief executive officer of the state. It would probably make a very interesting and ethical case for schools. You are the governor of a southern state who has discovered liabilities that should be paid, but are also planning to use those liabilities to enrich yourself. The state you are governor of has also instituted a racial reign of terror and will strip the right of self-determination from nearly half the state. Solve for why I should care. So what is Russell's plan? Russell has two obstacles in his way. One, the 11th Amendment, and two, what if, even after the Supreme Court tells North Carolina to pay its debts, they tell him to go piss up a rope? Russell has answers to both. The 11th Amendment only applies to individuals. If another state were to be gifted the bonds and sue over them, well, the 11th Amendment wouldn't apply now, would it? Sure, there's a difficulty in procuring that state, but if it can be done, the 11th Amendment is no obstacle. Okay, so that only leaves what if, once you get a judgment, North Carolina just tells said state to go pound sand. This is something the Supreme Court weighs when making its judgment. See Marbury v. Madison if you have doubts about the Supreme Court ruling in a way that is influenced by the enforceability of its decisions. Anyway, that's what attracted Russell to these particular bonds in the first place. They had that most wonderful of things, collateral. In other words, these bonds had something of value attached. What was that collateral? I like trains. The stock of the North Carolina Railroad. The bonds were underwritten by government-owned shares in the North Carolina Railroad, the very same one that Russell had tried to break Southern Railway's lease on. The proposed solution, if the ruling went through, would be to sell the underlying stock to pay back these bonds. Which, to be clear, is not what Russell wants. He wants North Carolina to pay the bonds. This is because selling the stock in question wouldn't actually be enough to pay back the bonds. That said, the state is unlikely to let that stock go because the big controversy that lost Russell his political career was control of the North Carolina Railroad. Do you think Democrats want to lose control of the North Carolina Railroad? I don't, and neither did Russell. Back to the state versus state workaround of the 11th Amendment, there's also another issue with this tactic, namely that it's already been tried and failed. The court had used a loophole to get out of that. They said that the states were trying to collect the bonds for someone else, so technically not a state versus state case. Russell's workaround on this was that the bonds the state in question received would not be lent for the purpose of collection, but would in fact be a charitable gift. Thus, the previous precedent is no longer applicable. The endgame of all of this is that North Carolina, having no other alternative, will settle with the current bondholders for much higher than the 25% face value, or face the consequences of all the bonds getting donated to the placeholder state and having to pay the full amount, which they wish to avoid. And before we proceed further on this sojourn, let us stop to say that this is a lot. That was a long digression to explain how Russell is going to collect a good chunk of change from North Carolina. In order to have constructed this insane flowchart of what is happening, you'll have to have a pretty good and tight grasp on a lot of arcane facts. When I said Russell did a lot of research on the North Carolina Railroad, I wasn't blowing smoke. When I said he was a lawyer and a judge, I meant it. He is not some geek off the streets. This lawsuit has been very well thought through. Critically, Russell has an exact endgame before his erstwhile opponents, North Carolina Democrats, have even the faintest whiff of what is happening. They don't know what is coming, and crazier still, they don't know Russell is behind it and won't know for a while. They'll just have to run around with their hair on fire, trying to figure out what to do in the meantime. In this narrative, there are a lot of people who call themselves lawyers who are very much not ready for this case. This means the Democrats, the very same ones who chased Russell from power, are now about to get hit with this meteor of a lawsuit and not really have any idea of how to handle it. And that's on the talented side. On the incompetent boob side, they'll get the lawsuit and just start running towards the horizon, convinced they know what's going on, despite not actually having a clue. The qualifications for becoming a lawyer in turn-of-the-century North Carolina are rock bottom. Russell is about to show everyone the difference between a good lawyer and a bad lawyer. Speaking of North Carolina, what's been going on there since the White Supremacy campaign? To summarize how the years since 1898 have shaken out, Democrats run the state. The Supreme Court and governorship were out of their reach, for now, but they had a massive advantage in the legislature, so they did as they saw fit. Disenfranchisement of African Americans and illiterate whites, who had mostly opposed the Democrats, was the weapon chosen. A literacy test with a grandfather clause. And the same red shirts who showed up in 1898 were magically back to make sure this constitutional amendment passed. If you're curious as to how effective this was, the 1896 gubernatorial election had the highest turnout of any governor's election in North Carolina until 1920, when the voting population doubled to include women. So the effect of disenfranchisement was the elimination of what Democrats would term undesirable voters, i.e. non-democratic voters. So the Democrats more or less take full possession of the state with racist violence and intimidation. In case you felt any modicum of sympathy for the state of North Carolina whom Russell was plotting against, you can now safely dispose of it. The state government of North Carolina was the most he was no angel of all time. And although Russell does not cut a terribly sympathetic figure, it's hard to say his vengeance doesn't bring a smile to my face. Russell's first move was to secure actual bonds, which, since there wasn't an actual register of who owned what, should have been difficult, but actually wasn't. One of the holders had been petitioning for full payment for a while, so identifying a party with a good chunk of bonds was pretty easy. The Schaefer brothers of New York owned some of the bonds Russell was interested in. The current rate the state of North Carolina was offering for them was 25% face value. Since they are $1,000 face value, it's $250 per bond. The Schaefer brothers had 234 bonds, so the math works out to $58,500 total. Not nothing, but considerably less than the $660 apiece they had paid for them. It would be a $95,000 loss if they cashed them in now. So definitely not worth it. The Schaefers are ready to try whatever to get something back on these bonds, but we've got a couple speed bumps in our way. Russell is still governor, and if Russell tells them his plan to get paid on these bonds, the Schaefers are just going to take the plan and not pay Russell. So Russell needs to covertly sign them up to his plan, without telling them the plan, and also stay secret because he's had the phrase, "lynch the fat son of a bitch," yelled at him enough for one lifetime, thank you very much. So that's all very hard to do. Since he's governor, he can't go there in person without arousing suspicion, so he sends a liaison to liaise with the Schaefer brothers. In exchange for this service, this person will receive a cut of the final profits. This whole mess becomes a bit much for Russell and his liaison to handle, so Russell asks for an assist, someone he owes money to, Benjamin Duke, the richest man in North Carolina. I told you he was in debt. Duke personally vouches for him. Anyway, having earned at least a portion of the Schaefer brothers' trust, an agreement is reached. Beyond that 25% face value that North Carolina is currently offering for the bonds, Russell and company will get 30% of anything collected beyond that. It's not optimal considering, but they didn't exactly have a strong negotiating hand. They have a plan, unspecified, from a person, unspecified. And the people Russell is negotiating against, the Schaefer brothers, had held on to the debt for 20 years in hopes of a better settlement. They had patience, Russell did not. He had debts. The deal was done. Okay, so if the bonds are paid, then Russell's paid. Good first step. Step 2 is getting a state to sign on to be the plaintiff against the Supreme Court. And for this, Russell gets some help. For a cut of the action, he signs on North Carolina Senator Marion Butler. Remember how I said the Populists got one of the Senate seats as a result of fusion, back when the Populists were relevant in 1894? Well, that's this guy, Marion Butler. He was the leader of the Populists in North Carolina and, well, the entire United States. So he's a well-connected man. Senator and party leader, a perfect man to scout out a possible state to use as a vehicle to circumvent the 11th Amendment. He delivers the state of South Dakota, which was a pretty easy pick. Butler had strong ties to South Dakota in that the Populist Convention of 1900 was held there. So, South Dakota is the state. Butler's connections in South Dakota did the work of passing legislation to allow the Schaefer brothers to donate the bonds and the additional work of arranging payment for lawyers to take on the case on South Dakota's behalf. Yes, they'll benefit, but this is ultimately a case for some New York financiers, something the people of South Dakota do not care about. So part of the payment for this lawsuit on South Dakota's behalf will come from the bonds donated, but the other half will come out of Russell's pay. Russell also gives cuts to connections in Michigan and Nevada, who both consult on the lawsuit and pass laws enabling their states to do what South Dakota was doing, in case South Dakota didn't come through. I'm betting a lot of you are starting to see how Russell got into debt in the first place, aren't you? That's a lot of cuts. But you gotta spend money to make money, and one of those spends does pay off in spectacular fashion later. We will get to that bit of extra special corruption later, though. For now, the lawsuit moves forward in the fall of 1901, when this was somewhat more defendable because Russell had stopped being governor in January of 1901. So there's the bonus of it only being mildly corrupt versus wildly corrupt. Progress! Replacing him as governor was one of the Democratic leaders of the White Supremacy campaign, Charles Aycock. His speech-making during the White Supremacy campaign was the highlight of his resume, but I have alluded to him earlier in the video. Remember when I mentioned that the psychotic populist candidate for governor stabbed someone in 1892? Aycock was the stabbee. See, the populist candidate for governor, his name is unimportant, had called Aycock a liar. Aycock had confronted him and demanded he take it back. The populist refused. Aycock countered by calling him a liar. The populist demanded Aycock take that insult back. Aycock refused. The populist, this time with a knife in his hand, demanded Aycock take it back. Aycock again refused, picking up a stick. And then the stabbing commenced. Good fun all around. Now, besides being funny, the story is also instructive. When confronted by a strange and unknowable situation, Aycock dealt with it the same way a baby deer deals with an approaching semi-truck on the highway. Speaking of strange and unknowable situations, How does he deal with a lawsuit from South Dakota over repudiated bonds? To be fair, what was he supposed to do? He's just gotten hit with the mother of all weird lawsuits. South Dakota, who is younger than 3 of his children, has out of nowhere filed a lawsuit to collect 45-year-old bonds that are supposed to be dead and buried. It's as improbable as being threatened with getting stabbed by a gubernatorial candidate. So he made a public comment about the lawsuit, appointed a legal team to answer, and avoided talking about it in public. Nothing terribly proactive. North Carolina's legal team isn't really worth going into too much detail about, except for 2 points. One of them is named James Edward Shepard, a former North Carolina Supreme Court Justice. Not to be confused with James Edward Shepard, a slightly different spelling, who is just as important, who founded North Carolina Central University. They are different people. This isn't really important in any way to the narrative, it's just a very large annoyance to someone who had to research these guys and I wanted to vent. Thanks for listening. 2, and more relevantly, George Roundtree of Wilmington is also on the legal team. As mentioned earlier, white supremacists rose up and violently overthrew the government in Wilmington in 1898. Now, I could explain George Roundtree's role in fomenting that violent racist revolution, or I could just mention that in the official state-sanctioned report from 2006 on what happened at Wilmington in 1898, Roundtree's name is mentioned over 100 times. Roundtree is also, it turns out, no novice to the law. He's the legal architect of the recently passed superstructure that would cement white democratic control in North Carolina, which included grandfather clauses and literacy tests. You know, the usual. Well, let's see how the great Mr. Roundtree fares when his opponents aren't unarmed African Americans he's sicking white militias on, and is instead a team of lawyers who have meticulously prepared the legal battlefield before he even knows it exists. There's probably one more person whose reaction to the lawsuit I should mention. Josephus Daniels. He's come up a few times before now, the anonymous Mr. X interview Russell did, a leader of the White Supremacy campaign, and after the election his newspaper, the News and Observer out of Raleigh, the largest newspaper in the state, published the headline, "There is Retribution in History." When the South Dakota lawsuit hits, well, Daniels has no idea what is happening. But as an insider with many years of political double-dealing in North Carolina, Daniels knows there is a greater power behind this gambit. Someone is pulling the strings, and he knows who it is. It's Southern Railway. I have not mentioned Southern Railway at any point in describing the structure of this lawsuit, but for whatever reason, Daniels blamed them. The first entire year of the lawsuit, Daniels is absolutely convinced that Southern Railway is using the lawsuit to get ownership of the North Carolina Railroad, and publishes that in his newspaper. Which, to be fair again, he doesn't have a lot of good information. And what information he does have, especially behind the scenes, says that railroads do a lot of corrupt stuff, so it's probably them. I mean, there's the 99-year lease. Then there's their involvement in the white supremacy campaign, both in front of and behind the scenes, which Daniels was involved in. So if he wanted to be an honest newspaperman, he could have said, "Oh yes, I know Southern Railway is a bad actor and must be behind this because they funded the white supremacy campaign I was also a part of to violently overthrow the populists and Republicans. This lawsuit must be an extension of their behavior." He could have said that, but he didn't. He just made accusations with nothing behind them. And he kept doing it even when the truth comes out. Yep, even years later he'd be building elaborate conspiracies about how Southern Railway was behind it all, even after Russell and Butler's role in the lawsuit was revealed. That must have brought Russell so much glee after Daniels had tortured him during the white supremacy campaign with distorted cartoons, knowing that he was behind all this lawsuit and Daniels was going after the wrong person the entire time, and in fact was going after someone he didn't like, Southern Railway. It is truly magnificent when your two enemies fight. Alright, so the next stage of the lawsuit is preparation for arguments, which more or less takes up all of 1902. This includes the very fraught prospect of discovery, where North Carolina's lawyers will depose everyone involved and will probably discover Russell's involvement in the whole process. Which does happen. Eventually. It took a lot longer than it should have. The North Carolina lawyers go to South Dakota and depose everyone involved there. Okay, so the Schaefers gave South Dakota these bonds as a gift to use as leverage to collect on these bonds. No bombshells, though. So the North Carolina lawyers then trudge to New York and depose everyone there. The Schaefers dutifully say, "Yep, that's what we're doing." Crucially, though, the North Carolina connection to Russell remains unrevealed.
Next, the lawyers returned to North Carolina and do a few depositions there, including Russell, who had, as everyone knew at the time, done a lot of research on the North Carolina Railroad and been governor when the Schaeffers had started making noises about it getting their bonds repaid at Russell's discreet insistence behind the scenes. So they actually depose Russell. They don't uncover that he's behind it all. If you're wondering why the North Carolina side of this lawsuit is getting short shrift from me, this is why. You couldn't figure it out? You had the mastermind under oath and you still couldn't put the pieces together? Mr. Policeman, I gave you all the clues. Okay, so if it doesn't get revealed in the depositions, how does it get revealed? Well, I never said it didn't get revealed in the depositions. The people in South Dakota kept their mouths shut. The people in New York kept their mouths shut. And the people in North Carolina kept their mouths shut. So who squealed? Well, I didn't mention the depositions in D.C., and they happened last. Marion Butler was deposed, and he is not as clever as everyone else. Butler was a lawyer, yes, but he was more a party leader, and more than that, an idealist. To give you an idea of what kind of idealist, he owned a newspaper and essentially named it White People. Subheader, Pure Democracy, White Supremacy. Catchy, huh? But what to do when you are in a coalition that depends on the votes of black people, as Butler was in the 1890s? Well, he kept the name of the paper, but that subheader? Gone. Butler was a populist first and foremost. He's racist, but if you are black and willing to vote for his beliefs, he's more than willing to put that racism in his back pocket. His idealism was for the motivating ideas of the populist movement, not racism. Not to say he wasn't racist, he was, but he cared a lot more about the populist ideas than the racism. Of course, idealist does not translate to excellent secret keeper. So that's how it got out. And don't worry, no good deed goes unpunished. He will actually be the one who suffers the most from this revelation, not Russell, believe it or not. So, cat's out of the bag, but good news, it held long enough. All the political violence had more or less ended in North Carolina. This is the end of 1902. The red shirts that had terrorized Russell had gone home and had been home for more than 2 years. Democrats were in charge and African Americans disenfranchised. So there was no need for a white supremacist paramilitary. Russell is in the clear, at least on that count. And yes, I did say good news in relation to African Americans getting disenfranchised. This is not a happy story. It is, however, in some parts funny because Russell is bringing a large amount of suffering to the Democrats who did it. I will take what I can get. Speaking of suffering Democrats, back to Josephus Daniels. Upon finding out this news, days before Christmas, he blows a gasket, screaming about the perfidy of Butler and Russell. And Southern Railway, who he's still convinced is behind all of this. Yep, Josephus Daniels is still very much chasing that conspiracy theory, in spite of all evidence to the contrary. People in a cult whose doomsday predictions fail are asking more questions about what's going on than Daniels is. I would also like to clarify that Southern Railway has commented on record at this point that they are not, in fact, behind this particular evil deed. Lots of other ones, not this one though. The case was tried early the next year in April of 1903. I've already outlined what the case for South Dakota is. The debt is real, there's an obvious remedy. The 11th Amendment does not apply. If North Carolina doesn't pay, sell the stock and give us the proceeds. The North Carolina crew came up and argued the opposite, and after that, there was nothing left to do but wait for a ruling. Everyone sort of did their own thing. Marion Butler sold land in Mexico to white South Africans. George Roundtree won a golf tournament while it was snowing. And one of the other lawyers I haven't mentioned yet published an article in the Washington Post affirming that the New Testament conforms to all standards of legal evidence. It's a very odd bunch we've assembled here. Anyway, in November, the ruling comes down. Drumroll, please. The Supreme Court wants to hear arguments again. Okay, so the re-argument is set for January 8th, 1904. First and 10, do it again, I guess. Except no, there's a difference this time. The court has already heard arguments and has questions, so we're doing it again. If someone, say, had a large contingency of well-connected lawyers working for them, they might hear a rumor or two from an acquaintance about what the holdup is. And what's more, once hearing this rumor, they could tailor their arguments accordingly in the re-argument, giving them a massive leg up. Which is what happened. I told you one of the people Russell brought on board would be important. It was the guy who wrote the paper on the New Testament meeting legal standards. I didn't mention his name, but it's on screen. I didn't want two people with the same last name dancing about the narrative. I've already mentioned how annoyed I am at the James E. Shepherds of the world. Anyway, this new information is incorporated into the arguments of Russell and Company, and it pays dividends. February 1st, 1904. The state of North Carolina has until January 1st of 1905 to pay South Dakota $27,400 for their bonds, or failing that, 100 shares of North Carolina Railroad stock were to be auctioned off to repay the bonds. The auction was to happen after a public advertisement for 6 weeks and to take place on the east side of the Capitol building. A victory for South Dakota and one step closer on the road to getting paid for our little band of misfits. A few things before we move forward, however. The decision was 5-4, so despite the rather logical arguments, there's a substantial minority that doesn't want to rule in South Dakota's favor. To show you how far afoot these arguments go from basic logic, a quote from the dissent. The court now decides that it has jurisdiction because of the delegation, in the second section of the third article of the Constitution, of judicial power to the United States over controversies between two or more states, and because of the grant to this court of original jurisdiction over cases in which a state shall be a party. As a personal bias, I've always assumed the Supreme Court is nothing more than a political body, making rulings based more on what it wants to happen versus whose argument is more supported by evidence. So in my view, its arguments are often not particularly serious when it comes to stated reasons, like trying to dicker over the meaning of the word controversy. It's nice to have that confirmed in the dissent, which by definition is not the opinion that takes precedence, but in a 5-4 decision it's rather important to take seriously because it almost won. And in this case that matters a lot because there are unique elements, such as the underlying stock that is used as collateral. So let's look at the actually serious argument from the dissent against ruling for South Dakota. My mind cannot escape the conclusion that if, wherever an individual has a claim, whether in contract or tort, against a state, he may, by transferring it to another state, bring into play the judicial power of the United States to enforce such claim, then the prohibition contained in the 11th Amendment is a mere letter, without spirit and without force. Which is correct. I don't think the Supreme Court should be a clearinghouse for bad state debts. The Supreme Court has more important things to worry about, like ruling that corporations are people, and the Sherman Antitrust Act applies to unions. Although it should be said states shouldn't have abrogated enough debt to become that much of a problem. I think this is a particularly effective argument from the dissenters, with a legitimate threat behind it. We are going to get slammed by so much work if Southern bonds can be collected through this one neat trick, so are you ready for that to happen? Speaking of which, not all of these have collateral. How are you going to collect on those? Are the justices ready to fill the docket of the Supreme Court with this one issue? It's a persuasive argument to make to their fellow judges. But for now, our heroes have triumphed. Heroes? Protagonists? Not the bad guys. The not the bad guys have won. South Dakota is going to get paid. Oh wait, this is only half the battle. They still have to negotiate their own payment, which does not go as well as hoped. 1904, the year this was ruled, was an election year. So South Dakota, Russell and Company, will have to wait a year, not just because of the election, but because the legislature ends its session in late winter, early spring, and it didn't have a ton of time to digest this particular decision. So I suppose Governor Aycock could have been proactive in the teeth of active opposition in his last year in office to get these bonds paid and negotiate a settlement with Russell and friends. I suppose the legislature could have been consulted and called into special session in case a deal is reached. I suppose pigs could fly and Russell could have sold those off to pay his debts, but we live here in the real world. No one is sticking their neck out before an election, and if you'll remember, the last time Aycock stuck his neck out, it got stabbed. Any settlement would have to wait for a new year post-election. So, new governor, new legislature, same Josephus Daniels. Speaking of which, how did he take the decision? Good, I hope. Butler and Russell should get their 30 pieces of silver for what they had done. Sure, comparing them to Judas, perfectly natural, I get it. Then he goes the teentiest bit overboard and says that the Schaefers should donate all of their bonds to South Dakota, as he would rather pay South Dakota the full amount rather than any money to the Schaefers. Which is probably a perspective that is going to change soon enough. It's a lot of money to just be handing over willy-nilly just to prove a point, but it shows where he's at in his grieving process. Anger. And that is not a feeling he was alone in. In his most telling reaction from a column from May 4th of that year, Josephus Daniels lists those repudiated outstanding Southern bonds by state. Not the railroad bonds, not the North Carolina bonds, all of the Southern repudiated Reconstruction bonds. All $300 million worth of them. Which is where I want to pull out a bit. $300 million worth of bonds. Face value plus interest. All practically worthless, some getting repayment offers as little as 2 cents apiece from the states that issued them. The issue was dead and settled. Sure, there was always the occasional case that flared up, but since the Supreme Court had ruled in New Hampshire versus Louisiana in 1883, 9-0, the debts had more or less been a dead letter, an issue that could be ignored with little problem. But now a Republican, and a Southerner no less, has resurrected the problem. This isn't about the North Carolina Railroad bonds for less than a couple $1,000,000 total if everything gets paid at full value. That whole sideshow of a controversy is less than 1% of the outstanding repudiated bonds. No one cares about these particular bonds. They care about the other $298 million worth of bonds out there. To quote the Atlanta Constitution, "Repudiated bonds rise from graves against the South." Do I sound like I exaggerate? And while in the paper they did highlight the collateral in the North Carolina case as being a unique feature making other collections more difficult, that is not a point of law everyone respected or thought was as big of a deal. Sharks were circling. Sharks like our very own Marion Butler and Daniel Russell. In the first half of 1905, they were a part of a consortium that was trying to gather together more Southern bonds to make a try of collecting in a similar manner. Consortiums that were advertising in the New York Times. So this isn't a hypothetical, this isn't a might happen, this is a very real reality. Despite the unique characteristics of South Dakota versus North Carolina, things were looking less happy in the Southland. There was blood in the water. And yet, nothing else really came after South Dakota versus North Carolina. You'd think this would be an open invitation to at least try again with a different set of bonds, but no. It never reached the Supreme Court again. And it's not like the committees that formed to collect on these bonds didn't try. A litany of other states were offered the same deal as South Dakota. Free money if you accept these bonds. But no one took them up on it. Hell, even foreign countries shied away from them, as they were also exempt from the 11th Amendment. But why? Why was everyone so gun-shy all of a sudden? There are several explanations offered by various sources. The book I read to try and better understand the 11th Amendment pointed at the ascendancy of the Dunning school of thought when it comes to the Reconstruction period. In other words, scalawags, carpetbaggers, and of course, African Americans aren't suited for government and ran wasteful, corrupt governments, so of course debts incurred by them shouldn't be honored. To be clear, I'm not saying John Orth believes the Dunning school. He most decidedly does not. He's saying the prevalence of the belief at the time is what caused the avoidance of the bonds. Not that he believes that nonsense, it's that citizens at the time believed it. And this was an era that gave us Thomas Dixon and his very strange racist books about Reconstruction, so it's plausible enough. But I don't think it's sufficient enough. I think it's an important part of the bigger picture, but more context is needed. Going to Robert Durden's South Dakota versus North Carolina, which I drew a lot of this video from, he also mentions the Dunning school as a contributing factor, and also does not subscribe to that theory. He points his nose towards a more active explanation as for why no other state followed South Dakota's path. In order to do the whole South Dakota thing where you sue over a repudiated Southern bond, the state legislature has to make a choice. They have to pass legislation. This isn't something that someone somewhere can do off on their own. It needs to be enabled and legalized by both the governor and the legislature. That's what happened in South Dakota, and that's what would need to happen elsewhere for this scenario to unfold. So in order for the bond plan to be enacted again, the state's political elites would have to acquiesce. More of them would have to be on board than not. So what would the consequences of that be now? What would accepting these bonds mean in terms of direct action? Well, let me show you an interesting series of charts. It is the Senate from 1890 to 1920. It'll advance every 2 years, showing different sessions of the Senate. The blue represents Democrats, red represents Republicans, and anything else represents mixed or, I don't know, a populist or whatever. Like one Republican or Democrat or some other combination. I want you to keep an eye on the southern part of the map. You know, the southern states. The ones that would be directly affected by the repudiated bonds being collected. Does anything stand out to you? Oh yes, it's almost unanimously Democrats. Like there's one-party rule. Democratic Party rule. The democracy, if one would be so bold as to borrow a term. Accepting those bonds means making an enemy of those states. And since this is pre-19th Amendment, except for the last map, these senators are all directly elected by state legislatures. So to choose to accept these bonds means making an enemy of 22 senators who will never support anything a senator from your state proposes. Does that sound like a prospect that is worth around $27,400 minus expenses? No, of course not. Outside of entire bond issuances, it doesn't sound even remotely worth it. Russell's instinct for secrecy was well founded in the early going. It allowed him to essentially get the drop on North Carolina on the bond issue the first time around. There's been a Supreme Court case since then, so no one is getting the drop on anyone now. No longer can anyone just sneak through a lawsuit on bonds. Anytime the subject comes up, it will attract a swarm of attention. You will be hearing from a lot of people on this subject. Lots of news stories. You'll even be hearing from a Southern governor, maybe more than one. Is whatever cut you get from the bond collection worth it? It doesn't feel like it, does it? Especially when the South was actively taking up the case against the bonds. The South Dakota case sneaked through. This will not be happening again. Any future rumors would be met with immediate and decisive pressure from the South. Which is what Durden points to as the key factor in the end of the relevance of these bonds. Governor Glenn of North Carolina, Aycock's successor, made direct appeals to governors of the states where this was attempted, Michigan and New York, and squashed the attempts. This more aggressive posture when it came to bonds ultimately ended the threat. So nobody else took up Wall Street financiers on their offers of repudiated bonds. Lots of stories about states looking into it, not a lot of stories about it going much further. The settlement of South Dakota versus North Carolina is essentially the end of the story about these bonds. They hadn't really been a big issue for a long time, but outside of Daniel Russell's coup, they are, from now on, a buried issue. Before we get back to the grand denouement of this whole lawsuit, I need to talk about something important. I need to mention one very important detail about the bonds in the South Dakota versus North Carolina case that I have withheld thus far. Now, you may think I've been talking about them for the last very long time, but I actually haven't. I've told you very little about them. I've said they are Reconstruction bonds, that they are repudiated, and that they are backed by North Carolina stock. That's not much. So let's remedy that. The bonds were repudiated by North Carolina in 1879. A constitutional amendment was passed repudiating the debt, sort of. I mean, repudiating them, like exchanging them out for bonds that are worth less. Different words, same meaning. The bonds were repudiated because of the supposed corruption of Republicans, and specifically African Americans during Reconstruction, the whole Dunning School approach I mentioned earlier. To give you an idea of what that sounds like, here is what Dunning scholar Harry Thurston Peck says in his book, 20 Years of the Republic. There was seen the spectacle of governors of states carrying them to low orgies, bundles of state bonds which they filled amounts in according to the amount they needed for debauchery. Legislative halls which had been honored by the presence of learned jurists and distinguished lawyers were filled with rabble of plantation hands who yelled and jabbered like so many apes, while drunken wenches sprawled upon the dais before the speaker's rostrum. It's rather unambiguous. Peck is saying that all of the Southern debts were illegitimate. Evil African Americans were responsible for the debt being run up by their profligate and corrupt spending. Which does come into conflict with that one very important piece of information that I need to tell you about our bonds that I have thus far kept to myself. The North Carolina legislature passed a law to issue the bonds in late 1866, and the bonds were issued by Kemp Battle, the Treasury Secretary, in July of 1867, the next year. The legislature in 1866 passed a law to issue the bonds. In 1866. The 1866 legislature. The legislature of 1866. It's not Reconstruction yet. The legislature is just made up a bunch of ex-Confederates. This isn't scalawags, this isn't carpetbaggers, this isn't newly freed slaves. It's a bunch of slave owners. Apologies, former slave owners. They lost the war. If you want to know exactly who is in this legislature that approved the bonds, it's not Daniel Russell. Remember how he got elected to the legislature around this time to avoid criminal charges? Well, he's gone at this point. He lost his re-election in 1866. The newspapers at the time attributed that loss to his support for the Howard Amendment. Do you want to know what the Howard Amendment is? Go on, guess. I didn't know either. I had to look it up. Got your guess ready? It's another name for the 14th Amendment. The Howard part comes because a Senator Howard of Michigan was one of the authors of the 14th Amendment, specifically the part that granted citizenship to former slaves. So if Russell is out because of the 14th Amendment, which if true, good for him, What does this mean for the people who are elected? It means the 14th Amendment was rejected 44-1 in the North Carolina Senate and 93-10 in the North Carolina House. Is this what we are meant to credit as a Reconstruction legislature? The legislature that approved and sold bonds was so white supremacist, they overwhelmingly rejected the 14th Amendment. That doesn't exactly fit the bill of a Reconstruction legislature full of newly freedmen, if you know what I mean. The whole contention that these bonds were issued by the Reconstruction legislature is a lie. They were issued by Confederates in the brief window after the Civil War, but before Reconstruction actually began, not by freedmen. That's ridiculous. This is just another lie on the pile at this point for white supremacists. They claim they were fighting corruption in 1898. That's wrong. Russell was. In 1899, after retaking control of the legislature, they reappointed a bunch of railway commissioners he had booted off for being Southern Railway lackeys. So they literally did the bidding of Southern Railway. They were objectively pro-corruption. During the white supremacy campaign, Democrats claimed that North Carolina was suffering under something called Negro rule. That's another lie. There were only 5 black state legislatures in 1898 out of 170. Not even close. I could go on. In 1900, when the Democrats were pushing a constitutional amendment for literacy tests, they swore up and down it wouldn't be used to disenfranchise white people, only African Americans. Which, I mean, the two wings of the North Carolina Republican Party at the time were African Americans and Appalachian whites. Do you think of good schools and literacy when you think of Appalachia? No, so of course it would be used to stop them from voting as well. Lies all around. The point that white supremacists lied prolifically during Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, the Fusion period, and after probably isn't an earth-shattering revelation for most people. They are white supremacists, of course they lie. Their whole ideology is a lie. It's not shocking they'd lie about other stuff. I would, however, highlight that it's not a problem unique to this period in history. This was and still is a problem that plagues political discourse. If you ask the average person on the street how much lies and mistruths characterize politics today, you'd probably get a very strong answer in the affirmative. Politics in the United States today are not that different from politics in 1890s North Carolina. You may disagree, but let me ask these simple questions and I'll move on. Do powerful media figures still use hatred of minority groups to drive support for politicians who are not working in the best economic interests of the people being lied to? Do rich people still fund attacks on those who would work against their political interests, using hatred of minorities as a pillar of that? Finally, did a political figure focus primarily on economic concerns during their term in office, but in the end fall victim to the worst people on earth because he didn't think of them as a real threat until it was far, far too late? Yes, it's not a perfect comparison, but there are definitely a few shades of Daniel Russell and Joe Biden, and it's not like either had a particularly happy ending. So yes, lie's bad. Back to our merry band of weirdos, how did all this finally shake out? Well, Governor Aycock stayed around, and true to form, he punted the problem to the next administration like a knife to the gut. In January of 1905, the new guy got to work trying to hammer out a compromise with Russell and friends. Russell tried some finagling up in South Dakota to give himself more leverage, but it didn't pan out for reasons previously outlined. The heat had gotten too hot. So the settlement Russell got wasn't as expansive as he'd hoped for. It's not bad, though. So let's run through the math. South Dakota gets full payment because it's either that or sell the state's stock in North Carolina Railroad, and that ain't happening. So full payment of $27,400 for them. That leaves the Schaefer brothers to get paid. The state of North Carolina's final offer was $892 per bond. To get around the constitutional amendment from 1879 declaiming the bonds, they claimed they were paying $250 on principal and the rest was interest. Whatever helps the lawyers and clerks involved sleep at night. Let's math out who gets what. The Schaefers received around $156,000 from the settlement. Russell and the gang received around $43,000. Here's how the division of money breaks down. I'm not reading all the people on the list, but Russell and his liaison got $15K, Butler got $5K, the guy in Michigan who got the Supreme Court tip got $5K, the rest got spread around, including $1,600 for money advanced to Russell by the Schaefers for the case because he was broke. I told you he was in debt. To answer an interesting question, did the Schaefer brothers make money on the whole transaction? Technically, they got back a couple thousand more than they paid for the bonds. However, if you add in all the other expenses they paid trying to collect them, it's not close. They lost a ton of money. So how about Russell? Did the bonds solve Russell's money problem? No, of course not. Nothing was going to do that outside of actually reforming his business practices for a modern world, and he could have done that at any time but didn't. Russell died a few years after the verdict, in debt, his machinations having only delayed the descent into insolvency until after his departure. His massive plantation near Wilmington was sold off piecemeal, although his house is still standing. If you want to look it up on Zillow, you can. Someone in the last few years bought it so they could flip it, and it's just an amazing redecoration job. I have a hard time picturing what Russell would have thought if someone said he should redecorate his house in purple. He probably would have asked if he could borrow some money. Russell spent his final years basking in the glory of his victory. Which was fair. He had done something that not even the greatest politicians could ever accomplish. Winston Churchill would take a shot at it a few years later when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer as a way to lessen British World War I debt and come up empty. That being said, Russell's legacy in history is pretty easy to point at. His lack of fight when white supremacist Democrats came for the rights and lives of North Carolina African Americans is what he will always be known for. Justifiably so. Although he is not unique in abandoning African Americans. In 1902, while the depositions were underway in South Dakota versus North Carolina, the Republican convention in North Carolina made clear what the position of the Republican Party post-disenfranchisement was vis-a-vis African Americans. White Republicans did this by singing a racist song at prominent African Americans who had tried to attend the convention and instead of being welcome were ejected. Morning, night, or noon, it's better to be a white man than a racist slur that rhymes with noon. White Republicans had made the decision to exclude African Americans from their party because there wasn't any need to appeal to African American voters. Because of disenfranchisement, appealing to African Americans for votes had no benefit electorally, because they couldn't vote. So while Russell was abandoning African Americans to seek his fortune through a quixotic lawsuit, Republicans were directly and forthrightly abandoning them because it was more beneficial to appeal to only white people. Different roads, same conclusion. If you want to know more about Daniel Russell, I recommend reading this biography by Jeffrey Crow and Robert Durden. It has the most insane Russell story you'll ever hear, but also very in character for him. It's about his attempts to appeal to African American voters during the 1896 Republican primary. It's exactly as bad as you think it is. I'd also recommend reading the book South Dakota versus North Carolina, also by Robert Durden, if you want to know more about the intricacies of the lawsuit. As you can tell by the name, I heavily relied on it as a source for this video. Durden has a lot of special insight into the thought process of how Russell thinks because he got a hold of a lot of Russell's private correspondence. If you want to know how, read the book, it's actually very funny. If you guess that debt plays a role in how Durden got a hold of these papers, you are correct. For a second reason to pick up South Dakota versus North Carolina, a footnote. A strange thing to use to recommend a book, but on page 9 of the book, Durden is speaking on the conditions of African Americans during fusion, and he cites Dr. Helen G. Edmonds' book, The Negro in Fusion, and says it is the best recent study of the subject. Dr. Edmonds was an African American historian at North Carolina Central University that had published The Negro in Fusion 10 years earlier, and it had attracted a bit of controversy as it accurately described what happened during the white supremacist campaign and the Wilmington 1898 race riot, and white supremacists, of which there were a lot in 1951 North Carolina, did not appreciate this reappraisal of history. That Durden cited this book favorably in an environment where 6 months earlier the Freedom Rides took place and a year after publication the Children's Crusade in Birmingham starts is most gratifying. It shows the acceptance of her work by fellow North Carolinian historians like Robert Durden. I like Robert Durden. Governor Charles Aycock was never stabbed again in his life. That I know of. Marion Butler lived the rest of his days in relative peace and prosperity, but was never again politically relevant because after the Populists disintegrated, he became a Republican. He chose Republicans instead of Democrats because despite being more ideologically aligned with the Free Silver Democrats, there was just too much bad blood. They personally blamed him for the schism in 1894 that threw them out of power. Also, his involvement in the Bonds affair was held against him by the largest newspaperman in the state, Josephus Daniels. Speaking of Daniels, he went from being the editor of the largest newspaper in North Carolina to the Secretary of Navy under President Wilson in 1913, thus also during World War I. He returned to private life until FDR became president. FDR appointed him ambassador to Mexico. This is the same Mexico that was invaded by the U.S. Navy during Daniels' stint as Secretary of the Navy. Mexicans did not react well to the news. FDR and Daniels both claim to have not remembered it. Daniels went on to serve as ambassador to Mexico, loathed at the beginning and beloved at the end. Official delegates were sent from the Mexican government in 1948 to Daniels' funeral when he died. It makes just as much sense with context. South Dakota, after being the winner in all this, basically getting $27,000 for little to no effort, expressed remorse about the whole thing, which was made easier when the alternative was making enemies with the entire South. They also made noises about returning the money, but never actually did it. The state of North Carolina remained locked under Democratic control until the party switch in the 70s, at which point the Republicans started to gain strength until they became more dominant. Although it's kind of a mixed bag where I wouldn't feel comfortable saying either party had the upper hand. I mean, what do you even call a state that has only voted for one Republican governor since 1992 and only one Democratic presidential candidate over the same period? Madness. That leaves us with the North Carolina Railroad bonds. Funnily enough, Daniel Russell managed to get a hold of some of those North Carolina bonds before the lawsuit started, so he didn't just walk away with the Schaefer brothers' fee as part of his haul from the lawsuit. He also got $892 apiece for those bonds. But what about the rest of the bonds? The Schaefers didn't have all of them, so what about them? What about the people who had the bonds and once they saw the settlement of 1905 decided to see if they were eligible? Are they getting the $892? Because that's what the Schaefers got. In a most respectable turn of events, 1909 gives us an answer. Yes, that's right, 4 years after Aycock passed on the problem to someone else, his successor passed on the problem to someone else. It's like that note presidents leave for the next guy when they leave office, except it's an IOU. The legislature passed a law essentially saying that all North Carolina Railroad bonds that were backed up by stock, the variety in the South Dakota suit, would be bought back at $892. So everyone who still had those bonds could get paid at the same rate. Huzzah! 20 years after the bond lawsuit, in 1923, when a random woman showed up with 13 of these bonds, she actually got paid out. She'd found them among her late father's possessions. I mean, officials had to have a big meeting about the whole thing, but they're legal. She got paid out for the bond she found among her father's stuff. I can't imagine how weird that must have been. Like a civil war goes sweeping in to meet all these guys in their knickerbockers and straw hats. Gee, any fiddlesticks, this lady like to collect on this 60-year-old bond, if you please. Don't that beat a Christmas tiger? But she got paid, which is where I'm going to draw this video to a close with a stern warning for viewers. Do not buy these bonds. I looked to see if the law mandating payback at $892 was still on the books and couldn't find anything. I assume and will practically guarantee these bonds, if found through some method like eBay or whatever, they will not be paid off. These are 150-year-old financial instruments. Please don't do that. I don't want to comment on this video of some sap losing $100 trying to collect on a debt that is older than their great-grandfather. I'm History Sock. Throw me a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you at the next committee meeting.